In 1880, if you stood in a railroad station in America, there might be 6 clocks on the wall. Each one showed a different time, and each one was correct. That's because every town in America kept its own local time. Noon was when the sun was highest over that town, not the next one, not the last one, and not the city 100 miles away. For generations that worked fine, then trains arrived. Once railroads started crossing states in a single day, those tiny differences stopped being harmless. A town could be 5 minutes ahead of the next one, another could be 8 minutes behind. Suddenly, schedules made no sense, connections failed, and mistakes could kill people. So in 1883, the railroads did something extraordinary. They didn't ask Congress, they didn't ask the states, they simply changed time itself. William Frederick Allen understood the danger before most Americans did. He was a railroad man, a timetable expert, and one of the clearest minds in a country that had begun moving faster than its own habits. He spent years staring at schedules, comparing routes, counting minutes, and watching a nation drag an old way of living into an age that could no longer tolerate it. The strange thing is that the problem he faced was not greed or corruption or machinery gone wrong. It was something softer than that. It was custom. It was the old way people had always lived, and that made it much harder to fight. Because before the railroad, local time was not a problem. It was common sense. If you lived in a small American town before the middle of the 19th century, time belonged to the sky over your own head. When the sun reached its highest point, that was noon. A church sexton, a jeweler, a town clock keeper, or a careful citizen with a decent watch might set the day from there. People rose with daylight, worked by light, ate by habit, and slept when darkness took the land back. Life was local, trade was local, news was slow, travel was slower, and the idea that one town needed to match its clock to another town 50 miles away barely mattered. A farmer did not need Boston time to plow a field in Ohio. A storekeeper in Indiana did not need Philadelphia time to open his shutters. If the courthouse bell rang at noon in one town 4 minutes later than the courthouse bell in the next, nobody died. Nobody even cared very much. That old world had its own sounds and rhythms. Bells marked worship, factory whistles where there were factories, marked shifts. Pocket watches came out of vest pockets and were compared in front of general stores. Men argued over whose watch was fast. Women timed meals by habit, by sunlight through a kitchen window, by the sound of footsteps on a porch, by the regular pull of family life. It was not chaos to them. It was order tied to place. That is the part modern people have to force themselves to remember. We hear hundreds of local times and imagine confusion. They heard our town's time and heard home. A difference of 4 minutes for every degree of longitude sounds tiny until you start crossing distance. But in a nation of scattered towns before the telegraph and railroad stitched those places together, small differences stayed small. A man might spend his whole life within 20 miles of the church where he was baptized. He would marry, on work, bury his parents, raise children, and die by a clock that belonged to his place alone. Time was not national. Time was intimate. But America did not stay intimate. As rail lines spread east to west and north to south, iron track connected towns that had once lived in practical isolation. Distances that had once taken days by wagon or canal began to collapse into hours. A person could eat breakfast in one city and arrive in another before supper. Mail accelerated. Freight accelerated. News accelerated. Telegraph wires clicked above the rails. Markets widened. Opportunity widened. So did the room for mistakes. The railroad did not just move people. It forced separate places into one working system. That changed what time had to do. At first, the old habits survived. Each station still kept its local time. Sometimes each railroad kept its own time as well, usually based on the city where its main office sat. That meant a town could have more than one legitimate clock at once. The station might keep railroad time for one line, another railroad time for a connecting route, and local town time for everybody else. A traveler could stand beneath a row of clocks and see a wall of disagreement, every face respectable, every face wrong for someone nearby. Imagine the sound of it. Steam hissing under a roof blackened by coal smoke, porters shouting, boots on wooden planks, a telegraph instrument snapping out coded pulses in a little office. Somewhere, a baby crying. Somewhere, someone asking the ticket clerk whether the noon train had left yet. The clerk points to one clock. The passenger looks at another. Both are telling the truth. That is how strange the country had become. And the deeper the railroads reached into the continent, the less that strange arrangement could hold. 100 miles of travel could carry you through several local times. A rail line stretching across multiple states could cross dozens of them. A timetable printer had to translate one town's noon into another town's noon into a railroad's chosen noon. Station agents had to understand the difference. Conductors had to remember it. Dispatchers had to trust that somebody, somewhere, had not made a small mistake that would turn into a large one at speed. Small mistakes are survivable when men walk. They become lethal when locomotives do not stop quickly. That was the railroad problem. Not that local time was foolish. It had worked for centuries. The problem was that speed had made old common sense dangerous. The railroad was a machine of discipline. It demanded measurement. Loads had to be counted. Grades had to be calculated. Fuel had to be estimated. Telegraph orders had to be understood word for word. Time itself had to become something harder than habit. A train meeting another train on a single-track line could not rely on the sun above 3 different towns. It needed one system, one standard, one language of minutes that every man involved could trust. And for a while, America did not have that. The result was a country running on compromise. Railroad companies chose standards of their own. Some used the time of headquarters cities. Some used the time of major terminals. Some routes changed reference points along the line. Printed timetables became objects of translation instead of clarity. If you missed a connection, maybe you had misunderstood. Maybe the railroad had shifted from one standard to another. Maybe your watch was right for your town and wrong for the line you were riding. Think about the ordinary strain of that. You have a wool coat that smells of cinders, a valise in one hand, maybe a child at your side, and a folded timetable in the other. You are changing trains in a station full of noise. One clock says 2:12, another says 2:19, another says 2:16. The train you need leaves at 2:15, but who's 2:15? That sounds almost comic until you remember that freight, livestock, business contracts, medicine, family visits, funerals, and military movements all depended on the answer. There is a reason Americans started calling the railroads the masters of modern life. They were not just selling tickets, they were teaching the country how to behave in a network. To understand why that mattered, it helps to slow down inside the railroad day. A station agent was not sitting in a calm office pushing papers. He was working in a place that smelled of lamp oil, damp wool, old wood, ink, coal smoke, and hot metal. He had to hear questions through noise. He had to copy telegraph orders accurately. He had to know when freight was due, when passengers would crowd the platform, when a connecting line was late, when mail sacks had to be transferred, when a locomotive crew needed instructions, and when some nervous traveler with a family in tow needed a straight answer. Under local time, when every answer came with extra arithmetic hiding inside it, a conductor had it worse. He had a watch, a timetable, orders, the authority of the company, and a train full of human beings or goods that all needed to reach the next point alive. On many lines, he also had single track ahead of him, which meant his movement depended on meeting another train at the correct siding or clearing the line before another train claimed it. The whole idea worked only if both trains obeyed the same clock. If one crew's understanding of time drifted even a little, a safe separation could vanish. That is the operational heart of this story. Standard time was not mainly about convenience at first. It was about preventing uncertainty from sharing the track with speed. Railroad wrecks burned themselves into the public imagination because they were violent in a way older travel disasters often were not. A wagon crash could kill a man. A boiler explosion could tear a coach apart. A head-on collision could splinter wood, fling iron, crush passengers into each other, and turn a line of cars into kindling and steam. Newspapers described mangled bodies, shattered limbs, and cars telescoped into one another. The 19th century did not hide industrial death particularly well. People could smell it on the wreck site. Not every collision came from time confusion. That needs saying clearly. But railroad professionals understood that inconsistent timekeeping made a dangerous business worse. A dispatcher could send clear orders, but if the clocks in different offices and on different watches were not truly aligned, clarity on paper turned foggy on the rail. A train that should wait could proceed. A train that believed it had right of way could meet another one rounding a curve or charging toward a junction. On a single-track railroad, minutes were space, and somehow it gets worse. Before truly uniform time signals became routine, even well-made watches did not stay perfectly matched forever. Watches gained or lost seconds. Men wound them differently. A jeweler might set one carefully, while another watch had drifted just enough to matter by the end of a long run. Railroad companies eventually became obsessive about watch inspection for exactly this reason. Precision stopped being a luxury and became a safety device. That discipline did not appear out of nowhere. It was learned through fear, embarrassment, costly mistakes, and the steady realization that an expanding rail system could not run like a loose federation of local customs. Every timetable that had to list multiple standards, every station with multiple clocks on the wall, every missed connection, every angry letter from a customer, every late freight arrival, every near miss on a single line pushed the industry toward the same conclusion. The old way was not merely old, it was becoming unworkable. This is where William F. Allen's role matters. He was not swinging a lantern on a platform or shoveling coal into a firebox, but he was doing the kind of administrative labor that modern people often underestimate until it fails. He worked in the realm of timetables, conventions, agreements, and coordination. That sounds dry until you remember what those papers controlled. Lives, freight, distance, delay. Allen helped gather the railroad world around a single question. Could the country keep pretending local time was harmless after railroads had tied distant places into one operational body? His answer was no, and by the early 1880s, more and more railroad officials agreed. There is another reason that agreement came when it did. Railroads were no longer local experiments by then. They were the steel skeleton of commerce. Grain moved on them, coal moved on them, cattle moved on them, manufactured goods moved on them. Immigrants, salesmen, grieving relatives, politicians, soldiers, drifters, school teachers, and preachers moved on them. Whole regions depended on rail connections to remain economically alive. Once a railroad became the artery of a town, the town could grumble, but it could not afford to ignore the pulse. That gave railroad executives leverage far beyond their formal legal authority. They did not need to own a town hall to shape a town's behavior. They only needed to control the line that brought in freight and carried out produce. A community that wanted to stay connected to the wider economy had to adapt itself to railroad discipline. And railroad discipline had a personality. It was exacting, impersonal, often arrogant, sometimes brutal, and deeply suspicious of local exceptions. The same culture that standardized gauges, signals, timetables, and accounting increasingly wanted time itself stripped of local personality. A system that large could not indulge every town's attachment to the sun. That fact helps explain why the reform moved through private coordination first instead of waiting for Congress. Railroad men did not believe they had time to wait. They had trains to run that afternoon. They had schedules to print next week. They had rival lines to coordinate with. They had telegraph orders moving every day. Practical men inside a large machine often act before public law catches up, especially when the law still thinks in older categories than the industry does. So the railroads prepared to do what old governments had rarely attempted on such a scale. They prepared to tell an enormous country what time it would be. The telegraph made the stakes even sharper. Before telegraphy, a railroad operated with slower information and wider margins for uncertainty. But once dispatchers could send orders down the line in minutes, and they could run more trains, more tightly spaced, with more confidence. That sounded like progress, and it was. But it only worked if everybody used the same time. Telegraphy gave railroads the power to coordinate. Standard time gave them the language to do it. Without that language, messages could be precise in wording and still fail in practice. Hold train A until 3:10. Let train B pass at 3:18. Send freight west at 3:25. Those are safe orders only if 3:10 means the same thing to every man reading them. Otherwise, the whole system begins to wobble. And when locomotives weighing tens of tons wobble, men get crushed. Railroad accidents in the 19th century had many causes. Bad track, broken equipment, human error, boiler explosions, weather, poor visibility, and reckless management all took lives. And time confusion was not the cause of every wreck, but railroad men knew it magnified risk. On single-track lines especially, where trains depended on precise meeting points and sidings, the wrong minute could become the wrong mile. The public did not always see the full complexity, but railroad professionals did. They lived inside the timetable. They knew that a 4-minute difference between cities could look harmless in a newspaper and deadly in an operations office. They knew that as trains got faster and systems denser, America was balancing a national transportation system on local customs built for horses and church bells. William F. Allen became one of the loudest voices saying so. He was secretary of the General Time Convention, the body where railroad officials wrestled with this problem. Allen was not the only reformer, but he became one of the central organizers of standard railroad time in the United States. He studied schedules with the obsession of a man who knew paper could kill. He argued for simplification, not because it was elegant, but because too many working men had to make too many risky calculations in too little time. And this is where the story stops being quaint. It is easy to romanticize a world of town clocks and solar noon. It sounds gentle, it sounds more human, but the railroad revealed the cost of that sentiment. An engineer leaning from a cab in winter wind did not need romance. He needed certainty. A dispatcher in a telegraph office lit by oil lamp did not need local pride. He needed everybody on the line to mean the same thing when they said 4:20. That need pushed toward one of the strangest power grabs in American history. Not by an army, not by a president, by railroad companies. Years before Congress turned standard time into federal law, the railroads had already decided the country could not keep running this way. They held conventions. They argued over boundaries. They worked out a plan big enough to cover a continent. The proposal would divide much of the United States into 4 major time belts: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. Simple enough to print, teach, and enforce. Broad enough to replace a patchwork of local times with something a railroad system could actually use. There were technical arguments behind those boundaries. Of course, geography mattered. Existing rail routes mattered. Connections mattered. The ideal was not mathematical purity, it was operational usefulness. The country needed a system men could work with in stations, and on platforms, in dispatch offices, in newspaper rooms, and at town halls. What makes this moment extraordinary is not only the scale, it is the authority. The railroads did not have sovereign power. They did not hold elections on the question. They did not ask every city for permission. They built consensus among the companies and then prepared to impose a new order through daily necessity. That is how modern systems often arrive, not with a speech, with a schedule. As the plan took shape, newspapers began discussing it. Some civic leaders welcomed the change. Merchants liked regularity, travelers liked clarity, railroad men liked survival. Scientists had long favored more uniform timekeeping as well. Meteorologists and astronomers had their own reasons for wanting standardized reference points. The idea was not absurd to educated Americans, but it still felt intrusive. Many people heard the proposal and felt what people always feel when a distant network starts rearranging local life. Who are these men to tell our town when noon is? That resentment mattered because it was not entirely irrational. Local time was not just a habit, it was a statement that a place had its own standing in the world. Solar noon said the sky over your town still meant something. Railroad time said the line mattered more. And the line was coming. November 18, 1883 became the turning point. On that day, American and Canadian railroads adopted standard railway time. Clocks and stations were reset. Timetables were synchronized. Noon arrived twice in some places, at least in the minds of people watching old time yield to new time. The phrase that stuck was the day of two noons. Picture the scene in a town waiting for the change. Men gathering outside a depot with hands in coat pockets, a jeweler watching his regulator clock, the station master listening for the telegraph signal. Maybe a church nearby still holding to local noon. Maybe a courthouse clock not yet changed. A crowd knows something unusual is about to happen, but the event itself is almost absurdly quiet. No cannon, no parade, just hands moving on a dial. That is all it took. A nation was reordered by small mechanical gestures repeated in hundreds of places. Some towns shifted by only a few minutes, others by much more. In some places, noon under the new system came before the sun stood highest. In others, it came after. The sky had not changed, but the social meaning of the hour had. The clock was no longer reporting nature. It was reporting agreement. I mean, think about that for a second. For most of human history, if a clock disagreed with the sun, the clock was wrong. The railroad age turned that inside out. If the sun disagreed with the network, the sun lost. Newspapers covered the change with fascination, amusement, approval, and irritation. Some described confusion. Some praised the clarity. Some treated it as a practical reform. Others treated it as one more example of corporations telling ordinary people how to live. Both views had truth in them. The system was useful. It was also imposed by private power. That tension is what makes this story bigger than timekeeping. America did not just adopt time zones because a committee of philosophers decided it was elegant. The country accepted them because the railroad had become too important to contradict. When the lines that moved freight, passengers, mail, and money said the nation would now run on 4 standard time zones, most places eventually bent. Not all at once, though. Some towns resisted. Some public clocks kept local time for a while. Some businesses used one standard while churches used another. Some city governments dragged their feet. There were places where railroad time and local time coexisted awkwardly, dividing daily life by function. If you were catching a train, you used railroad time. If you were meeting someone in town, maybe you still used local time. Imagine the petty arguments, the missed appointments, the stubbornness of older residents who had no desire to let a railroad clerk correct the sun. And those arguments were not just petty, they could cut to the bone of local identity. A town clock sitting on a courthouse or church was not only a device, it was a symbol. It told residents that their town stood at the center of its own day. Resetting that clock to satisfy a railroad timetable could feel like lowering a flag. There were communities where ministers, businessmen, editors, and municipal officials all had different views about how quickly to yield. Some treated railroad time as obviously sensible. Others treated it as an insult dressed up as efficiency. You can hear the tone of the resistance even without quoting every local paper. It had a familiar sound. Why should a private corporation decide our noon? Why should this town abandon what the sun plainly shows? Why should the clock on the wall answer to a schedule made in some distant office? In a country that already worried about monopoly power, those questions had force. But supporters of standard time had their own answer. Because the train will not wait for your civic pride. Because commerce now runs through connections your grandfather never had to think about. Because the mail, the market, the telegraph, the timetable, and public safety all need a common standard more than your town needs symbolic independence in the matter of noon. That clash played out not only in editorials, but in awkward daily compromise. Some schools shifted earlier or later by a few minutes. Some storekeepers posted times in both systems for a while. Some factories, tied to broader commercial routines. I favored the railroad standard sooner than churches or household routines did. In a few places, people learned to ask not simply, "What time is it?" but "railroad time" or "local time." That is the sort of sentence a society uses only when it is living through a transition big enough to split reality in two. For ordinary people, the transition could feel faintly ridiculous. A mother sending a son to the depot had to make sure his watch matched the railroad, not the family kitchen clock. A businessman might keep one watch for town use and another mentally adjusted for rail appointments. Jewelers, who had long served as local authorities on accurate time, suddenly found themselves mediating between nature, civic custom, and private network power. In some towns, that role made them small kings of confusion for a season. But the confusion did not last forever, because the network kept winning. There's a pattern here that repeats across modern history. A new system first arrives as a convenience for specialists, then it becomes a necessity for workers, then it becomes a burden on holdouts. Finally, it becomes invisible to everyone born afterward. Standard Time followed that path almost perfectly, and the workers who enforced it were not gentle abstractions. They were railroad men with company rules behind them. If the timetable said departure at a certain hour under the new standard, the train left then, whether a town approved or not. That is the kind of everyday authority that changes culture more effectively than speeches do. Each departure taught the same lesson: adapt or be left behind. The physical setting of those lessons matters too. A railroad depot was one of the great classrooms of modern America. Farmers, merchants, traveling salesmen, immigrants, widows, politicians, laborers, children seeing a locomotive up close for the first time, all passed through that space. They saw clocks, they heard departure calls, they learned the authority of printed schedules. They felt the social pressure of precision. The depot taught punctuality in a harder accent than any sermon. And no, it was not some pure triumph of reason, it was discipline. Useful discipline, often necessary discipline, but discipline all the same. If you stood on a platform in winter, cheeks cut raw by wind, and watched the station clock govern everyone's movements, you were seeing more than transportation. You were seeing one of the great transfers of power in the modern world. Place was losing to system. Custom was losing to coordination. Human beings were being retrained to fit the needs of an industrial network whose scale no previous generation had known. That is why the resistance story matters. Not because the holdouts had a real chance to win forever, but because they recognized what was being surrendered. They understood that this was not only about minutes, it was about who gets to define reality in public life. In the end, the answer was the network. Once standard railroad time proved its practical value, the older arguments began to sound noble, but weak. The man waiting on a freight shipment cared less about solar purity than about whether the shipment arrived when promised. The traveler trying to catch a connection cared less about local dignity than about whether the second train had already left. The growing industrial city cared less about the sun's exact local position than about coordinating labor, deliveries, markets, and communication with other cities doing the same thing. That is how adoption widened from the railroads into the rest of American life. Not by philosophical surrender alone, but by repetition, day after day, train after train, clock after clock, noon by noon. And as the years passed, the very people who once resented railroad time often began relying on it without comment. A generation grew up inside the new order. Children learned school hours set by standardized clocks. Businesses posted hours that matched broader commercial expectations. Newspapers printed time-sensitive information meant for readers beyond one town alone. Regional identity remained. Local pride remained. But local time as a sovereign fact began to die. There is something almost melancholy in that. A whole way of belonging ebbed out of life, not because anyone declared war on it, but because trains ran on time better without it. That is modernization in one sentence. The old world is not always defeated because it is false. Sometimes it is defeated because the new machinery makes it impractical. By the time federal law arrived in 1918, much of the emotional war had already been settled by habit. Congress still mattered, of course. Formal law matters. But in this case, the law followed obedience, not the other way around. The railroads had already done the harder work of retraining the country. And that retraining did not stop with the railroads themselves. It flowed outward into factories, offices, stores, schools, court sessions, on newspaper deadlines, financial markets, and eventually into the ordinary expectation that people far apart should still live by a common schedule. A society that once tolerated local noon differences as trivial began treating lateness by the common clock as a character flaw. That is a remarkable cultural shift when you step back and see it whole. The same nation that once let each town answer to its own sun became a nation where a few minutes late could mark you as careless, unreliable, even disrespectful. Railroad time did not create discipline by itself, but it gave discipline a uniform face. Once the clock became common across distance, social judgment could travel with it. So the resistance faded, but the memory of what had been lost still lingers underneath the victory. In some sense, every complaint people make now about feeling ruled by schedules, deadlines, and systems larger than themselves belongs to the long afterlife of this railroad moment. The country gained enormous power by standardizing time. It also taught generations of people to live according to a clock that cared nothing for local weather, fatigue, season, or the position of the sun. Useful, efficient, necessary probably, but still a surrender. And that is why this is not just a story about clocks. It is a story about the bargain modern life keeps asking us to make. Specific holdouts became part of the folklore of the change. Cities and towns in different regions clung to local time longer than reformers liked. The details varied place to place, but the pattern remained the same. Resistance usually sounded local, moral, civic. Support sounded practical, commercial, modern. Behind that was a deeper fight over what kind of nation America had become. Was it still a collection of places, each anchored to itself, or had it become an interlocking machine that required common standards from strangers who would never meet? The answer, increasingly, was the machine. That answer came with a cost. Standard time made travel safer and schedules more intelligible. It made commerce smoother. It reduced the burden on railroad workers who had been translating multiple systems under pressure. It helped integrate the national economy. All of that is real. But something else was being surrendered. Time stopped belonging to the immediate world and started belonging to abstraction. Before, noon was a fact you could almost feel. The sun at its height, shadows shortened, heat sitting differently on a roof. After standardization, noon became an appointment kept with distant places. You could stand in your own town at 12 o'clock and know the heavens disagreed, but the nation did not. That is one of the hidden prices of modernization. It gives us coordination by taking intimacy. It gives us reach by thinning place. You gain the ability to connect a continent. You lose the old comfort that your daily life answers first to the ground beneath your feet. Railroad men would have answered that trade was worth it, and they were probably right. Try running a national transportation system any other way. Try moving milk, steel, passengers, soldiers, newspapers, and livestock across thousands of miles on local solar time. It was not going to work. The issue was not whether change would come. The issue was who had the power to force it first. On that question, the railroads won. What Congress did not do in 1883, the railroads did anyway. Federal law lagged behind lived reality by decades. The country increasingly operated on standard time because that is what the network required. Local ordinances and civic decisions spread the practice further. The old system did not vanish in one afternoon, but it was mortally wounded on the day of 2 noons, and no one could honestly claim the railroads had overreacted. The more America industrialized, the more standardization proved necessary. Factory work relied on synchronized shifts. Commercial exchange relied on predictable communication. Telegraphy and later ever more centralized systems relied on agreed reference points. And even people who resented railroad time often found themselves using it because everything around them increasingly demanded it. That is how powerful systems win. First they inconvenience you, then they become unavoidable. Finally, they feel natural. By the early 20th century, standard time had become part of ordinary American life, though the legal foundation still trailed behind practice. Congress finally acted with the Standard Time Act of 1918, which formally established standard time in federal law and placed time zone boundaries under national authority. That law also introduced daylight saving time as a wartime measure. But by then, the essential transformation had already happened. Congress was not inventing the system. It was ratifying a reality the railroads had made. That's not a typo, by the way. For roughly 35 years, much of the country had already been living inside a standard time regime created by railroad coordination before Congress formally nailed it into federal statute. When you hear that, the usual story of modern government doing modern things starts to wobble a little. In this case, private infrastructure got there first. The state came later with paperwork. There is something almost unsettling about that. We like to imagine the most basic frameworks of life, law, borders, currency, official time arriving from clear public authority. But the American clock on the wall is also a monument to corporate necessity. The railroads did not conquer the country with speeches. They conquered it with dependence. That dependence rested on labor as much as policy. Remember the men who lived this change at ground level. Dispatchers hunched over telegraph keys, conductors comparing watches, engineers peering into weather, station agents explaining time differences to frustrated travelers, clerks rewriting timetables, jewelers resetting town clocks. These were the people who turned theory into daily obedience. And there were workers farther back in the machine as well. Track gangs in mud, bridge crews over black water, firemen shoveling coal into the furnace, brakemen risking limbs between moving cars. Railroad history is often told through magnates and maps, but the system only became strong enough to standardize time because thousands of forgotten men made the network physically unavoidable. They laid the iron that made local custom collapse. That is the larger shape of the story. Progress did not float in as an idea. It arrived filthy. It smelled of hot oil, steam, smoke, telegraph varnish, wet wool, and creosote. It came with crushed fingers, frozen platforms, missed meals, bad lungs, and long nights under rules that kept tightening as the network tightened around the country. When people talk about modernity as if it were clean and inevitable, they leave that out. They leave out the workers who absorbed the danger. They leave out the people whose bodies paid for the precision everyone else learned to take for granted. And no, I'm not making that up. Every improvement in timing and coordination sat on top of a transportation world that could maim you without ceremony. Even so, standard time endured because it solved a real problem. That is why the resistance faded. People complain about new systems for as long as alternatives remain livable. Once the alternative becomes obviously worse, sentiment loses. Town pride could not keep trains from colliding. Local noon could not organize a continent. The old way had dignity, but it no longer had capacity. There is a lesson in that beyond railroads. The systems that reshape daily life most completely are often the ones that hide their own violence best. Once standard time settled in, later generations stopped seeing it as a decision. It looked like nature. Children learned time zones in school as if they had always existed. Watches, office hours, school bells, market openings, broadcast schedules, all of it ran inside a structure that had once felt radical. That is how infrastructure disappears. It becomes common sense. The same thing happened with the philosophical shift underneath it. Americans stopped asking what time it is here and started asking what time it is there, and later, what time it is everywhere. The frame widened. The nation widened with it. A railroad decision changed the scale at which ordinary people imagine their own day. You can still feel traces of the older world if you look carefully. The mismatch between solar time and standard time remains. In some places, the sun stands highest well before noon by the clock. In others, well after. Most people never notice. Their phones update automatically. Their computers correct themselves in silence. They wake to alarms linked to networks so vast and accurate that the old disorder feels almost impossible to picture. But picture it anyway. Picture a station in 1880, 6 clocks on the wall, brass rims dim and smoky light, one train waiting, another overdue, a man in a heavy coat asking which clock he's supposed to trust. Picture William F. Allen and the other reformers deciding the country cannot go on like this. Picture November 18th, 1883, when the hands move and a nation agrees, reluctantly, to stop taking noon from the sun. That is one of the great hidden turning points in American life. No battlefield, no election night, no famous declaration. Just a silent transfer of authority from place to system. The clock on your wall is the descendant of that transfer. Every hour you schedule, every meeting you keep across distance, every train, market, school day, broadcast, and flight that depends on common time carries some part of the railroad settlement forward. It feels ordinary because it won completely. And that should leave you with a strange kind of respect. not only for the ingenuity of standardization, but for the scale of the world it replaced. For thousands of years, human beings lived by the sun above their own communities. Then, in a relatively short span, railroads persuaded an enormous country to live by coordinated agreement instead. Something was gained: safety, clarity, reach, a continent that could function in step. Something was lost too: the sense that time rose first from the land itself, from shadow and season, and the sky above your own street. Maybe that loss was unavoidable. Maybe it was the price of building a modern nation, but prices still deserve to be named. Because when progress works, it hides the bill. Standard time is one of those bills. It bought order with surrender. It bought connection with submission to a wider machine. It bought a common life measured not by where you stood, but by the network you served. And yet, here is the final irony. Most of us are grateful for it. Most of us would not go back. That tells you how complete the transformation was. The railroad did not just make old time inconvenient, it made new time feel inevitable. So the next time you glance at a clock and assume its numbers are neutral, remember the station wall. Remember the telegraph office. Remember the dispatchers, the conductors, the schedulers, the workers on iron lines stretching over a continent too large for local noon. Remember William F. Allen, staring at timetables and seeing danger in every unnecessary minute. Remember the day of two noons, when private companies changed how a nation lived without waiting for federal permission. Every clock in America now agrees with clocks hundreds of miles away. That feels natural only because the old system is gone. For most of human history, time belonged to the sun above your town. Then the railroads came. And in a single generation, Americans stopped asking what time it was here and started asking what time it was everywhere.